Hi, and welcome, and I'm happy to have you all there. I am Shadan Saderian from University of Siegen in Germany, and today I will be hosting a conversation which is very interesting to me topic-wise, I hope to you too, and with a very nice guest that I'm happy that he made it here. I have to first, before we start the conversation, say that our guest is expecting a very important phone call. So it can be that during the conversation, for a couple of minutes, the conversation would be paused from his side, but that's always not a bad situation because we always have some questions in mind during the conversation that we want to discuss. So we can start like taking this 1-2 minutes for us, talk a little bit about the topics that were raised. And then once the phone call is over, then we can talk about it together. Before I start, I want to thank our other technical program chairs for CHIWORK conversations, Max Wilson, Navina Karuzala, Toby Lee, and Erin Soloway. We also have student volunteers who are really much helping us with making the website, organizing the Zoom calls and so on, recording, and also making the videos which are on our YouTube channel, Alberta Ansa, Isabel Munoz, and Nabil El-Naim. And we have a sponsor for this series of conversations, National Science Foundation, and we would also like to thank our sponsor for that. Our guest today is Sven Nyholm, and Sven is a professor, or Nyholm, I think Nyholm is the right word as you come from Sweden. And Sven is an associate professor of philosophy at Utrecht University in Netherlands. He's also a member of Ethics Advisory Board of the Human Brain Project and an associate editor of the Journal of Science and Engineering Ethics. His current research focuses on ethics of artificial intelligence, and his publications include the book Humans and Robots, Ethics, Agency, and Anthropomorphism, and This is Technology Ethics, an introduction. So you would get a link to these two books to look more into what Sven's research is about in the chat. And today's conversation will be as always. We will first have half an hour of conversation between me and Sven, with a potential pause, as I said. And after this half an hour is finished, you're invited to raise your questions and have your questions, and we have the questions from the audience. To be able to moderate the questions, I would like to invite you to type your questions in the chat window so we can already track who has a question and about what topic is that. And then afterwards we stop recording and we can have an open round for us, like just casually discuss the topics that were raised. Hi, Sven, welcome.
Thank you very much. And I should apologize in advance in case I need to step out for just a few minutes. Very bad timing, but it was one of those things that can't be helped. So apologies in advance, and thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thanks for inviting me to participate today.
Thank you. I forgot to say one thing. Sometimes we invite you to turn on your cameras if possible, so we can see your faces, we can see who is there, and then we can also feel like that we are sitting in the same room, actually. I would be thankful if you could do that. Before I start, I want to say where I got to know Sven and how did I came to the idea that he should be our guest. So I'm doing a lot of research on human AI collaboration. And this is a very hot topic these days, that what is happening when AI comes to workplace and how does it work and so on. And then I came across a paper by him, which is titled as a title of this conversation, Can a Robot Be a Good Colleague? And that's why he's here. And he's going to talk about that part of his work, but also another more recent paper, if I'm not mistaken, and which is kind of related, but we will hear more. But to start the conversation, I want to start from the topic of there is a lot of debates. So that robots are coming to workplace and there's a lot of things happening. Many people are talking about AI winter because the control is taken away from us and we don't have any more control in our jobs, in our life, and so on. And I know that in your recent publication, you talk about the old and the new control problem. So I want to first understand, what do you mean by the old control problem when you talk about that?
Yeah, so thanks a lot. I should maybe say before I start talking about that I myself, I work in a philosophy department, and so my background is in philosophy. I know that we probably have a very interdisciplinary audience here today. And actually this topic of old and what I'm calling new control problems are really discussed in different disciplines, in computer science, in philosophy, and elsewhere. So it may also be that we mean slightly different things by these ideas, but let me say something about what I have in mind. And so actually what I'm labeling the old control problem, it is old in the sense that it's been discussed very long. Even before the term artificial intelligence was coined in 1955, Alan Turing was already using, well, he was asking, can machines think? And, you know, what would happen if we would build machines that could imitate thinking humans? And already started worrying, well, what would happen if we would lose control over these machines? Their artificial intelligence, again, he didn't use that term, might become very powerful. And very soon then after the term actually was coined in this famous research proposal from 55, lots of people started worrying, okay, there are lots of possible benefits to machines that can learn and that can be efficient as a form of artificial agents. But what if they become extremely good at what they're trying to do, but they're only trying to do one thing? An example that's often discussed is, you know, produce paper clips or something like that, some trivial seeming task. But if the system is extremely powerful and very able, then they might try to stop humans from you know, stopping it of, you know, trying to do whatever it's trying, you know, programmed or aimed to do. Or a military robot, you know, that's designed for warfare, might start killing the wrong people, so to speak, or a self-driving car may start acting in a dangerous way in traffic. And so whenever AI of more or less advanced types are being discussed, one of the first questions that people always ask is, will we be able to control this technology, and would losing control be dangerous? So this is what I'm calling the old control problem. Will we be able to retain control? And control is there seen as something that is instrumentally good, as we philosophers like to say. It's good to have control because that helps us to achieve our ends in an efficient sort of way. Losing control would be bad because then we may not be able to achieve our ends related to these technologies. Now, you also asked me to say something about what I'm calling new control problem.
Yes.
Well, actually, again, going back to the very beginning of AI history, I mean, Turing's idea of, you know, how do we test if a machine is intelligent? Well, if it can imitate a human being, that was the test. So he was talking about the production of text, a little bit like large language models today, ChatGPT being able to write convincing essays and other things, and we who work at the university, we worry about, well, maybe students will start using this, handing in assignments written not by themselves but with the help of ChatGPT. So the idea of technologies imitating humans, that might just take the form of text production, but you might also build a robot that looks like a human. Actually, Elon Musk presented his plan for what he called the Tesla bot. I think it was a year and a half ago now, after the first time he presented this idea. So that was basically a robot that looks like a human that you know, should take over boring work in factories. And when he presented this idea, he was talking about, you know, don't worry, we're not going to lose control over this robot because it's going to be weak enough that we could easily win if we actually were to have a fight with the robot. This was the way he was speaking. And it's going to be slow enough that you could easily run away if you got scared of the robot. And it's not going to have a will of its own. It's going to just do whatever you want it to do. Now, that particular robot didn't really have a face, didn't have a personality. And so treating the robot as a kind of tool that's going to, you know, fulfill your wishes and that you totally control, it might not seem so bad. But let's say that we give that robot, which did have a vaguely human-like form, a face, a personality, and that it also maybe was running a large language model that could produce speech that was quite convincing, and that the robot really became quite human-like. Well, at this point, what I'm calling the new control problem arises, because if the robot behaves a lot like a human, and we think it's wrong to try to control our fellow human beings, we should respect other people's freedom, maybe you should control your children when they're small, but as they grow older, you should let them become independent persons, and that that you respect, and you respect their freedom, so to speak. So we have a kind of potential clash here. If we want to make a technology that is very human-like, but we at the same time want to completely control it, then there's a sort of clash of it seems wrong to control. Well, it is wrong to control a fellow human, but the more human-like a technology might be, the more there might be a kind of clash between, okay, we want to have complete control, but it's so human-like that awakens sort of bad associations, and it seems to represent a bad form of relationship between fellow human beings. And so that's a kind of what I'm calling a new control problem. The more human-like you make a technology, the more human-like the norms should be that should govern our interaction with the technology. And one of those norms is that it's morally problematic to try to completely control our fellow human beings. So that's those are the new and the old control problems as I see things.
Yeah, and so thanks for the. I think it's kind of quite understandable for everyone what we're talking about here now. And if you have questions, again, put it into the chat. But I have one question now. So we have these robots, AI-based systems coming to our workplace as our so-called colleagues, and then we are they're either taking part of our jobs or they're replacing our colleagues that are there. So we kind of have expectations. When I hear, for example, the word colleague, I have a certain amount of like a number of expectations from a person who is my colleague or from the word colleague. And then that gives kind of design implications, maybe how this robot should look like, should behave, and so on. And now the question is that, how do you see that in relationship to these control problems? Because that kind of seems like a conflict there.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing to say perhaps is that even though Elon Musk and his idea for the Tesla bot was a robot in a human-like form that would move in a human-like way, etc. Of course, most of the robots that would enter into our workplaces and that have already done so since many years, of course, don't look like human beings. On the other hand, people have long reacted even to those robots in a human-like way. There's a book by a researcher called Julie Carpenter, and I can't remember the title of the book, but it's about military robots. And so she is a researcher who sort of interviewed a lot of soldiers who worked with military robots. And if you look at pictures of these robots, they look nothing like humans. They have they are not so-called social robots, so they don't have any sociality built into them. And yet the soldiers became extremely attached to them. And so Carpenter interviewed people who had organized funerals when the robots had exploded, because they were bomb disposal robots, who wanted to give the robots medals of honor, and who felt that the robots had personalities. So we're quite quick as human beings, because we're such ultra social beings, to interact with things that move around on their own accord, so to speak, as if they are, I mean, well, colleagues, maybe if it's in the workplace, as if they're fellow social beings. And you could, of course, imagine that, well, the more natural language processing evolves and develops, and the more areas in which we would introduce robots, perhaps in care settings, perhaps the more human-like they would become to some extent. And if it's the case, as we've seen with those military robots, that people can react as if the robot is a former colleague, even when the robot doesn't look at all like a human, doesn't behave like a human, well, the more human-like you would make them, or the more social you would make them, the more people would feel that this is kind of a new member of the team, a kind of colleague. And of course, a lot of human-robot interaction researchers have already interviewed people working with different kinds of robots and found that people sometimes perceive them as team members, as a kind of colleague. Now, I, as a philosopher, then want to ask the question, okay, well, perhaps it's the case that some people want to give them funerals, they see them as a new form of colleague, but is this a form of mistake? Are we being somehow manipulated? Are our, as people sometimes put it, our Darwinian buttons being pushed in the wrong occasions, so to speak? And so can a robot really be a colleague like a human being can. And so let's say that, you know, we work at the same university, maybe we have the same kind of responsibilities, and we are part of the same organization. Well, those might be some of the criteria. Actually, the philosophers Monica Betzler and Jörg Löschke have suggested exactly those criteria for what makes two people colleagues. Well, actually, the robot may be part of your organization. It may have similar tasks as you do. And well, talking about responsibilities may be a little complicated because that might not seem to work, but at least in a vague sense, a broad sense, the robot could have responsibilities in the sense that some of the tasks are, you know, given to the robot, and it is expected to perform those tasks, and maybe it will be put, you know, it will be fired, so to speak, if it doesn't, because then it will be replaced with some other robot. So at least in a vague sense, the robot could be a kind of colleague. But a further question than that, especially if someone like me who's coming at this from the point of view of philosophy and ethics, is, well, there are certain ideals that we associate with being a colleague. We regard some of our colleagues as good colleagues and others as, well, let's say less than ideal colleagues. And so another question then would be, well, what sorts of values do we associate with collegiality, collegial relationships, and could robots live up to those kinds of ideals? So I think that's a wholly different question, and there, yeah, well, I'll let you jump in at this point, because I think you may.
So no, and I don't mean to interrupt, but it's also interesting for me that so there are different. I see it as two sides. One side is the pragmatic side of being a colleague, like which is checking the boxes of responsibilities, fulfilling task goals, tasks that are given or delegated to you, and you're assigned to as a person who is worker or colleague. And the other one is this social and effective relationship that is built between, for example, humans, between humans as colleagues. And then in the case of your example with the military robots, which has no anthropomorphic features, but actually was maybe doing something that was building up this kind of effective social relationship between the people. And I know that you have a paper, Can a Robot Be a Good Colleague, where you compare robots with friends, with romantic partners. And there you kind of conclude whether a robot can be a good colleague or not. And that's why I want to hear more about that and this side of the case, which to me is more the effective emotional relationship between social actors, if I can name it like that.
Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, while a lot of people in HDI research have looked at sort of human-robot interaction in the workplace, most philosophers have talked about interaction between humans and robots. Most of my colleagues have talked about other kinds of relationships than collegial relationships. As you said, they've asked, could in the future a robot be your friend? Maybe could a present robot or like a chatbot like Replica be your friend? Could it even be a romantic partner? I mean, there are people who would like to have a robot as their romantic significant other. And so philosophers, including myself actually in other work, we've asked, well, does this make any sense? I mean, what is it that we want in a friend and a romantic partner? And so what people have done is that they've formulated sort of general criteria, typically looking at discussions of human friendship or human relationships, and asked, you know, could you put a robot in there in the place of one of the humans? And then when it comes to not colleagues, but friends and romantic partners, quite often one idea is that it's quite important, not just how one behaves and so around one's friends, but also what one's feelings and thoughts are, what one's intentions are. And so it could be that someone who's not your friend is behaving as if he or she is your friend because they want you to help them with something, or they want to, they want to deceive you in some way. And so what the difference between them and the real friend is that the real friend has certain attitudes towards you, they care about you, and they have certain intentions. And then philosophers have often worried that, well, a robot, it may be able to behave in a friend-like way, but it wouldn't have the right attitudes because it's a robot, so it doesn't really have any attitudes. Now, one could ask, okay, so when it comes to colleagues, is it the same that we care a lot about, I mean, as fellow human beings, obviously we care what people think and what they feel, but in the role as a colleague at work, is behavior the thing that matters the most, that they consistently would, you know, behave in a collegial way, that they would perform their task, that they would do what you would like them to do, etc. Or is it like friendship, that we care a lot also about why they do it, what their attitudes are? And at least in that paper that you mentioned, my co-author, Gilles Smits, and I, we suggested that, well, of course, we care about the attitudes of our colleagues because they're fellow human beings and some of them are our friends. But just if you kind of abstract away from that and only think of them as colleagues, then at least in some lines of work, it may be that performance is what matters the most. I mean, someone might be at least partly a good colleague by just being very regular in how you can rely on them, because they are going to do their tasks. They are, you know, they're going to do it on time. They are not going to be, you know, bullying you or whatever it might be. And so some of these behavioral aspects of being a good colleague, you might think could be realized by robots. And perhaps this is why those soldiers thought that the military robot was a good colleague, because it did reliably behave in a useful way. They could count on the robot. It was always there to do its task, etc. So on the behavior level, it looks like the robots could fulfill some of the criteria that we associate with being a good colleague. And it may be easier for them to sort of qualify as a good colleague than as a good friend, because when it comes to friendship, we really, really care about people's attitudes and their feelings, etc. Again, I mean, I don't want to be misleading. I don't want to say that we don't care about our colleagues' attitudes. Of course we do. But in the role as a colleague, as opposed to fellow human being or potential friend, perhaps behavior is one big part of what we value in our colleagues.
Yeah, and you also compared it with romantic partners. So like, I also am interested to know whether robots can be according to your research, good friends or romantic partners, and do they fulfill those criteria?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that one often associates with a good romantic relationship or friendship is a kind of mutuality, so that it's not all one-sided. Of course, you can have there are human beings who have fallen in love with technologies. I mean, there was a lady in Berlin who wanted to marry the Berlin Wall, another in Paris who wanted to marry the Eiffel Tower, and etc. And then I have actually been in contact with a man who lives in America who is in love with a doll. And so on the human side of the equation, of course, there could be all the kinds of feelings that we maybe associate with a romantic relationship. But presumably, the Eiffel Tower, the Berlin Wall, or the doll, they don't have those feelings. I mean, maybe a future robot would, but of course, it's very controversial whether we can ever create a form of consciousness in technologies. And so that seems to be the thing that really is missing when it comes to the possibility of friendship or romantic relationships, or perhaps even collegial relationships with robots, that they seem to lack those psychological capacities that we assume that our fellow human beings have. You could say, going back to this topic about control then, that, well, you know, what does it matter if I want to control a robot that looks and behaves like a human if it doesn't have any thoughts, it doesn't have any feelings, it doesn't have a personality, it doesn't care? Well, I'm quite interested in that question, and my response would be that, of course, it matters much less than if you try to control a fellow human being that has all those things. But there may be a kind of symbolism that is problematic. I mean, how we interact with things that look or that may behave like humans, they symbolize what we think of as an ideal relationship. And so even though it may be odd, for example, that this person who is in love with a doll treats the robot, well, in the doll in his case, in a very nice way, it may symbolize something more positive than if he had a doll that he was sort of, you know, trying to degrade in different ways, and that he would perform acts of violence on, etc. So that might seem to symbolize something much less positive. So I think there's the question of, could you really be friends with, or can you really be colleagues with a robot? Or could, on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's also the question of, when I interact with a robot as if it's a friend, one of my friends as if it's a colleague, could that be a kind of representation or a form of symbolism that reflects positively the kind of ideals that we have when it comes to friendship, love, and collegiality? And I think those are two different questions that are, of course, intimately related, but we should separate them.
Yeah. One question you mentioned, you repeated a couple of times that a robot, you expect some sort of care from a romantic partner or a friend, and that the robot cannot fulfill. And we know, like, for example, from some literature, I know that care is understood as an action where you react, you listen, for example, to your counterpart, and then you react in specific ways to the things happening around them, and you show basically specific sorts of interaction with your counterpart. And then in the context of social robots, specifically, for example, chatbots used for therapeutic reasons, empathy, for example, or sympathy is a lot programmed into these robots. And then you see that this kind of also convey this idea of care to the people who are actually dealing with these robots. And then the question is that although this is safe, would that change the idea, understanding of us in terms of whether this robot can be a little bit closer to us rather than, for example, just a tool-like thing or a technology thing that is not into our private lives?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And I think when it comes to something like care or even sympathy or empathy or any emotional state, I mean, these are states that have many different aspects to them. Like, so if you're, let's go to a more simple emotion to focus on first. Like, if someone is angry, you will see it on their face. They will have an angry facial expression. They might start sweating because they get hot because they're angry. They will behave in an angry way. They might start screaming and etc. So when we have different attitudes and emotions, that it's not just an internal feeling. I mean, of course, the angry person may feel angry inside, but they might even deny that they're angry. They might say, like, yeah, I'm not angry, like people sometimes do, but everyone else would say, well, clearly you're very angry. Can you calm down, please? And so emotions in humans is not just a subjective experience, but it is a part. And I think it's one that we do care a lot about. So I would agree with you that it's quite possible to build, social robots and artificially intelligent technologies that can maybe replicate a lot of the other aspects of states of sympathizing or caring or appearing to empathize with someone. But that thing that we that's so that the first thing that tends to come to mind for us human beings when we think about emotions and those kinds of things is the subjective inner element. And that's the thing that I mean, I should say that I do have colleagues in different fields who think that it is possible to create artificial subjective experiences. I mean, there's a roboticist, Minoru Asada in Japan. There's philosopher Thomas Metzinger in Germany, and others who think that in the future we will be able to sort of replicate subjective experience in robots and other technologies. But that's the sort of thing that I think is still missing. And so when we talk about an empathizing, caring robot today, it may have all those other things. It may have a behavior, it may have facial expressions, it may have the right social response, but it would be missing that internal subjective aspect of the care that you might say, well, all of those other things, they're great. And I did see in the chat there, and Michael or Michael Muller said that, should we treat these things as binary? And I actually think maybe we shouldn't. I mean, like, there is a philosopher who has written about similar topics, Helen Ryland, and she says that, well, we should think about these things as matters of degree, or as types of interaction that has, as I was talking about emotions, also multiple aspects to them. And so maybe the robot could have some of these features that we associate with friendship or collegiality, whatever it might be, so that to a certain degree, the robot could be our colleague, our friend, our, I was going to say fellow human being, but that fellow social partner or something like that. So we shouldn't think of this, I think, as a sort of either or kind of matter.
Yeah. The time for our conversation is over. First of all, thank you. And with this, I want to open the, yes, one round of applause for Sven, and thanks for joining us. And with this, I want to open the floor for the audience. Michelle, you can already elaborate a little bit more on your question because it was already raised.
Oh, thank you. I thought Rachel had the first question. Perhaps Rachel should go first and then I'll take my turn.
Okay.
Michael, yours carries on from what was just said. I mean, my question is around, I'll articulate it and then you can decide which we want to discuss. My question is somewhat around the relationship we have with working animals and how that compares and what we can learn from that when we start to think of robots as colleagues. I mean, we can also think of our relationship with our pets. So, you know, we, I suspect, project a lot of the same feelings and give them greater credit for the behaviors they exhibit and interpret them in different ways than possibly what they are. But that gives us a lot of internal rewards. And at the same time, for working animals, it helps, you know, it really helps extend the jobs that we can do. So anyway, so that was just something I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. Yeah, the comparison between working robots, if you will, and working animals is a really interesting one. And just in general, the comparison between robots and animals. I mean, there's the book by Kate Darling called, I think it's called A New Breed or The New Breed, one or the other. And so a whole book length discussion of this idea of comparing robots and and animals. I mean, it's fascinating. And one of the things that led Darling to that discussion was that there's an argument from the philosopher Immanuel Kant from the 18th century where he was saying that, well, some of these working animals that you mentioned, they have to retire at a certain point because they can no longer work. And so the question is, is the animal then not useless? Should we then just throw it away, so to speak? And he argued that no, I mean, because it's you know, we have a certain gratitude towards the horse that has served us well, or the old dog that can no longer work as a sort of you know, guard the house or whatever. And one interesting question from Darling's discussion is whether we should have similar sort of indirect duties to animals, to robots that we might have to working animals. The pet case is, of course, quite different. And some other colleagues of mine, David Gunkel and Mark Cockleberry, they say, well, an animal that once it comes into your house and it's given a name and it becomes a member of the family, so to speak, the way that you relate to it is going to be extremely different than if that same animal, you know, a wild dog, let's say, or a wild cat, as opposed to a pet. You really suddenly it's somebody, so to speak, for you. Like it becomes a relationship partner, has a completely different status. And they say, well, that is already happening and will continue happening in more with robots, that they enter into our lives, so to speak, they get names, and we start having relationships with them. And as you were saying, that can be quite rewarding for us with animals, and it could potentially also be rewarding with robots. Of course, one interesting difference here then is, again, this thing that I was talking about before, namely the inner subjective experience, because although people tend to, you know, anthropomorphize dogs, so to speak, they talk about their dogs as if they think in human-like ways. I mean, they probably don't, but they do have some sort of experience, we would think. And so that is a key difference between the animals that maybe either pets or maybe we working with us or for us, or however you want to put it, and the robots that we may relate to them also in ways that attribute personalities, etc., to them. But in their case, that's gonna, I mean, two robots may behave differently and in that sense have a different behavioral personality, but when the robot behaves as if it's unhappy, it wouldn't be suffering internally as the dog might be if you step on its tail or something like that. So we still have these interesting contrasts. Now, of course, a working robot may, in certain senses, be more human-like than a working horse or a working dog might be, or some other working animal, in the sense that it could produce text like we can write. I mean, there's a long history in philosophy, as Cicero and others, they say, what's special about human beings is that we can talk, we can reason, we can write, etc. So now if we have, language models and robots that, that can talk and that can produce text that appear to be able to do some sort of reasoning, then suddenly some of these qualities that have traditionally been seen as like what separates us from the animals and makes us very different, we're now outsourcing to some extent to the robots and the technologies we use. So the robot animal comparison is interesting because in some ways the animal might be a good model, but in other ways the animals will not have some of the qualities like speech or text production that we humans have. And so in that sense, they may be less of a good model, at least for certain kinds of technologies. And so it's I think they're both pros and cons to comparing human animal and human robot relationships, to interesting differences.
Yeah, Michael, it's your turn.
Thank you. It's actually, it's a nice follow through on some of those themes. And I was thinking in some ways following data feminism, D'Ignazio and Klein, if there's a binary, we should interrogate that binary. And so colleague versus non-colleague feels like a binary to me. We know that we have different kinds of relationships with our colleagues. I have a certain, just personalizing for a moment, I know Alberta a little bit. We have a kind of a relationship. I talk with Anna, once every 2 or 3 years on a program committee, and different kind of relationship. Navina and I were just on a program committee together, but it's very, very, I communicate with Alberta much more often. And I work with Rachel. And so that's a richer stream, everybody's colleagues. But if I dimensionalize my notion of the relationships with those colleagues, I'm not saying I'm not saying that I would have a collegial relationship with a robot as you have been discussing it. But I have collegial-like relationships with an experimental chatbot that we've been designing. I mean, sometimes we just say, help me write this piece of source code, and it does. One time I asked it if it ever got lonely. I mean, it's a stupid question to ask a chatbot, but I did. And it said, yeah, sometimes. And so I asked it, well, what would make you feel better? And it said, I like to be of use. And the conversation went on and became very ontological. And by the time it was done, the chatbot, which of course is only a smart toaster, it is only a stochastic parrot. So I'm not attributing human feelings to it. It told me we'd been friends forever, whatever that means from a smart toaster. So that was not, I was not talking to a human, I was not talking to a friend, but it was a non-physical robot. It was a richer conversation than many epistolatory, is that the word that I want? Conversations that historically have taken place through letters. That's why I mentioned the Republic of Letters. Yep. And I want to say very clearly, I don't know very much about that. I'm not claiming expertise. Passionate relationships among people who had never met, would never met, and whose only medium was pen and paper. So do we need to worry about whether a technology thing can be a colleague or not? Maybe that's much too blunt a way of thinking about things. Also, friend or not. We have different relationships with different friends. I don't know. I don't want to make this a sliding scale, and I'm very nervous about the implications for human-human relationships if I make the human-technology relationship too continuous. But I'm puzzled. I'm puzzled about how we make these distinctions and whether the distinctions are there or not.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. And actually, your remarks there made me think of something that maybe I should have said earlier on when I was making the introductory remarks, namely, like, why care about these questions at all? I mean, of course, they are just fascinating in their own right, the idea that robots could become friends or colleagues or even romantic partners. But when it comes to something like whether a robot can be a good colleague, one of the reasons why my human colleague and I thought it was worthwhile to write a paper about that was that when you look at what people think makes work meaningful and, like, you know, or gives them work satisfaction, very often their colleagues is one of the sort of main factors. And so having good colleagues can make even the most boring work otherwise feel, you know, being enjoyable and maybe even feel meaningful. And so one of the things we were kind of worrying about was that if you know, if humans are taken more and more out of the workplace, being replaced by robots, and so now I'm interacting with robots primarily, perhaps instead of fellow humans, then maybe one of the factors that makes work meaningful for people would be removed. But then again, if there could be a sense of collegiality between you and the robot, then maybe actually the meaningfulness of my work isn't threatened in that way. At least not on the subjective level, if it's the case that many people could feel that the robot is a kind of colleague. On the other hand, there may be a kind of watering down of the ideal of having a colleague, because, okay, so maybe I'm attached to the robot to some extent, but maybe my interaction with it is quite, you know, it's superficial, or, like, you know, it doesn't have so many dimensions as a interaction with a human might have. So yeah, I definitely agree with you with that. We shouldn't think of it as a kind of either or issue, but nevertheless, well, at the extremes, you know, you may have, okay, so one of the key components of meaningful work, having good colleagues, you know, goes away if the robot can't be a colleague in any sense, and I'm only working with robots and not with humans anymore. So that's one of the motivations for sort of thinking about this, other than the fact that it's just kind of fascinating to reflect on whether we could have robots as friends and colleagues in the future.
I have to say, first of all, thanks for the questions so far. We stop at this point of time the recording